Colleagues, allow me to start by recalling some of the health-related measures to be implemented within the premises of the Palais des Nations. The same measures were actually applied already during the 43rd session and will be continued until further notice. So all persons present in the Palais are required to be free of COVID-19 symptoms and to maintain the recommended physical distancing of 2 meters at all times. To ensure physical distancing when entering and exiting the conference rooms, separate doors, as you can see, have been assigned as either entrance or exit doors. Within the conference rooms, participants will be asked to circulate clockwise, and there will be 2 seats unoccupied between all delegates. Moreover, everyone physically present inside the conference rooms is required to wear a face covering mask, and UNOC requests that participants please bring their own masks. I'm grateful for your understanding and respect for all these measures. Let us now turn to the modalities for the 44th session. As you will recall, we had an informal discussion on the 23rd of June in order to take stock of the extraordinary measures applied during the 43rd session. Subsequent to that informal, the Bureau considered all the views and concerns and ideas that had been expressed by members and observers of the Council during that discussion. And then the Bureau decided that the modalities for the 44th session should be updated based on that informal discussion and subsequently approved by the Council during the opening of the 44th session, which is where we are now. So a technical note providing all the details about the proposed modalities for this session was developed on the basis of the concept notes, which had been sent out on the 26th of May and the 4th of June, on the basis of a technical note for the resumed session, which we had circulated on the 12th of June, and on the basis of the lessons learned during that 43rd resumed session. This note was circulated to members and observers on the 25th of June. On the basis of this technical note and the minutes of the Bureau held yesterday, on the 29th of June, I wish to propose to the Council for its approval the extraordinary measures to be applied during the 44th session, most of which were already applied before during the 43rd. So the 44th session will take place from the 30th of June to the 17th of July. I'm very pleased to inform you that UNOC has agreed to service 2 lunchtime meetings on the last 2 days, the 16th and 17th of June. So these are the days when we'll take action on draft proposal. And as a result, we all very much hope that we'll be able to finish the Council on Friday, the 17th of June. Plenary meetings will take place in the Assembly Hall. Voting will take place in room 20. Room 12 will be available as an overflow room with webcast in English. During the voting process, the Assembly Hall or another conference room will serve as an overflow room with webcast. Access to all meeting rooms will be limited to 1 person per delegation, except for the voting, as I will explain in a few minutes. A certain number of seats will be reserved for representatives of NGOs, National Institutes for Human Rights, and international organizations, as well as the press. State delegations not wishing to enter the plenary room physically will be able to deliver their statements via pre-recorded video messages as provided under HRC Decision 19/119. Similarly, NGOs in consultative status with ECOSOC will be given the opportunity to do the same, that is to pre-record video messages as far as interactive dialogues, panels, and adoptions of UPR sessions are concerned. Representatives wishing to exercise their right of reply remotely would be able to do so by sending a request to the email address HRC list of speakers in one word @ ohchr.org. They will receive an invitation to a video call 5 minutes prior to the moment when they will be able to exercise their rights of reply. Special procedure mandate holders, members of investigative mechanisms, and panelists unable to travel to Geneva will be able to participate in the interactive dialogues and panels via video messages and video calls, so this will be interactive. Those present in Geneva would address the Council in person if they so desire. The UPR outcomes of Spain and Kuwait will be considered at the 44th session based on the preference expressed by these states. The considerations of the adoptions of UPR outcomes for Kyrgyzstan, Guinea, the Lao People's Democratic Republic, Lesotho, Kenya, Armenia, Guinea-Bissau, Sweden, Grenada, Turkey, Kiribati, and Guyana will be moved to the 45th session of the Council because these countries expressed their preference for them to be postponed. For action on draft proposals, all 47 members of the Council may designate 2 representatives to be present in the room. A member of the Council not wishing to participate in person may opt for proxy voting by designating a representative of another state who will act on their behalf. Observer states introducing draft proposal as well as concerned countries may also designate 2 representatives to be present in the room at the time of action on relevant resolutions. All observer states and other observers may follow the proceedings in an overflow room. Rooms 18 and 20 will be made available for meetings of groups and for informal consultations. So let me remind all main sponsors, if you want to organize an informal virtually, please contact the Secretariat in order for these informals to be included in the bulletin of informal meetings and in our new online application SCED. Side events cannot take place at the Palais des Nations, as we said before. So in case any stakeholders decide to organize virtual events or physical events outside the Palais des Nations, these events will not be included in the bulletin of informal meetings as Council side events. Once again, let me underline that these proposed extraordinary modalities shall apply exclusively to the current circumstances and shall by no means serve as a precedent. Are there any delegations wishing to take the floor on any of these measures? I see none, so may I take it that the Council agrees to the proposed modalities and that they will be applied during the 44th session under the current circumstances? That seems to be the case. So thank you very much. We're now getting to agenda item 1, organizational and procedural matters. And I will now very briefly address other organizational and procedural matters. On the program of work for the 44th session, we have 3 very busy weeks ahead, as you have probably seen, with 7 panel discussions and 35 interactive dialogues, including with the High Commissioner on her annual report, as well as with 22 special procedure mandate holders, 2 commissions of inquiry, and 2 special representatives of the Secretary General. And as you will remember, we decided last December that there will be no longer any clustered interactive dialogues. Let me draw your attention to the fact that due to the exceptional circumstances, and in particular the time difference, to the locations from where some of the mandate holders will participate in the interactive dialogues, the debate under item 10 had to be exceptionally scheduled before the considerations of items 7 and 9. So all this can be explained by the time lag and the difficulty of organizing all these various interactive dialogues with people located all over the world. I would like to remind you that towards the end of the session, we shall proceed with the appointment of 4 special procedure mandate holders. I trust that the draft program of work may be approved with the understanding that it is an evolving document and that further adjustments may be required according to the progress of work. Are there any questions on that? So may I take it that the program of work for the 44th session of the Council is adopted? Thank you very much. On the list of speakers, ladies and gentlemen, the online system for inscription on the list of speakers for all interactive dialogues and panel discussions opened last Thursday, the 25th of June, and closes in 24 hours before the meeting in which the respective dialogue or discussion is scheduled to start. After the online inscription has closed, delegations may still withdraw by sending an email to the said address, hrc.listofspeakers@ohchr.org, whenever possible, rather please than by coming to the list of speakers desk for security reasons. As per standard practice, the list of speakers will close approximately 15 minutes after the beginning of each debate. The online system for inscription on the list of speakers for UPR outcomes will open on Monday, the 6th of July at 9 a.m. and will close on Thursday, the 9th of July at 6 p.m. As you know, no inscriptions will be possible after this deadline. Furthermore, I would like to remind that all delegations that due to the prohibition of distribution of printed materials, all oral statements should be electronically uploaded to interpreters at least 1 hour prior to the estimated time of their delivery. It is crucial, it helps interpreters prepare, and it increases the quality of the interpretation, so it's in your interest to upload these speeches on time, so please do so. This applies to statements made in person as well as to video statements. I was informed by UNOC that during the 43rd session this actually didn't work very well, so please let us make an effort to do better. I would also like to take this opportunity to strongly encourage all of you to respect speaking time limits for all debates and to exercise self-restraint in the preparation of your statements. Along with the Vice Presidents, we shall strive to ensure that meetings begin on time and that speaking time limits be strictly observed by everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to remind you that the deadline for the submission of draft proposals to be adopted during the 44th session has been set for Thursday, the 9th of July at 1 p.m. An extension of the deadline for the submission of draft proposals will be granted only once for each proposal under exceptional circumstances and for a maximum of 24 hours. In the interest of ensuring the effective participation of all stakeholders in the work of the Human Rights Council, I encourage main sponsors of draft proposals to share draft texts also with civil society organizations and other observers that follow the negotiations in the Council. With regard to the accessibility of our work, I would like to remind you that there is a focal point for accessibility within the Secretariat, who can be contacted if necessary, and I would like to encourage delegations to consider requesting the accessibility of mandated panel discussions to ensure live captioning and sign language interpretation. In addition, delegations are requested to upload their oral statements in Word so that they can be accessible to persons with disabilities. Please note the speeches uploaded in non-accessible format will not be posted on the extranet. I also wish to emphasize that the United Nations, including the Council, has a zero tolerance to any form of harassment, including sexual harassment, and that in this context, the Director General has pledged to implement the Code of Conduct meant to prevent harassment, including sexual harassment, at the UN events here in Geneva, and that I have appointed a gender focal point to assist with the implementation in the Council. Any and all complaints will be dealt with promptly. We encourage reporting of any incident directly to UNOC security officers. Furthermore, I cannot stress enough that maintaining a safe space for the active participation of representatives of civil society and national human rights institutions is not only part of the mandate of the Council, but is also our common interest. As President of the Council, I assure you that I will follow up on all allegations that I receive concerning acts of reprisal and intimidation that are carried out in connection to the Human Rights Council, its mechanisms and procedures. I call on everybody to take all necessary measures to prevent and ensure adequate protection against such acts. I thank you for your cooperation and for ensuring that this Council is a safe environment for all. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency, it is now my pleasure to open Agenda Item 2, entitled Annual Report of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and reports of the Office of the High Commissioner and the Secretary General. This agenda item will remain open throughout the session. It is a great pleasure and honor to invite the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mrs. Michelle Bachelet, to present her annual report and to give us an oral update on the human rights impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in accordance with the President's statement on this subject, PRST, stroke 43, stroke 1. Let me remind you that the interactive dialogue on the annual report is scheduled to begin this afternoon, and having spoken for a very long time now, it is my pleasure to hand over the floor to the High Commissioner.
Distinguished President of the Council, Excellencies, colleagues and friends, I'm honored to discuss with the Council the report on the work of my office in 2019, including our more than 80 field presences, that is Report A/HRC/43/3, the report that I presented at the beginning of the 43rd session of the Council in February, outlines efforts to assist states to uphold all human rights at a time of increasing challenges. Because I presented it already at that time, I'm not going to present it again. Those challenges are rising sharply today. I am glad to have this opportunity to update the Human Rights Council on our human rights concerns related to COVID-19, which continues to gather pace, including many countries with limited medical, social and economic capacity to cope with its consequences. 6 months after the first cases were detected, it is clear that this epidemic threatens both peace and development, and that it calls for more civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights, not less. The pandemic should spur us to adopt strong transformative measures to heighten the powerful protections that human rights-based policies can provide by promoting public health, public confidence in official guidance, and greater social and economic resilience. It urgently calls for leadership grounded in clarity, evidence, and principle to protect the most vulnerable members of society and to address the profound inequalities that are accelerating the pandemic's incidence and impact. Wherever they exist, disaggregated data indicate that members of racial and ethnic minorities and indigenous people are both more likely to die of COVID-19 and are hit the hardest by its socioeconomic consequences. This is particularly true of people of African descent, who across every area of the Afro-descendant diaspora continue to face unequal education, inadequate services and access to healthcare, and intersecting forms of structural discrimination that put them on the front lines in so-called essential jobs that deepen their vulnerability. Indigenous people are also particularly vulnerable. Inadequate access to healthcare and other key facilities exacerbates the risk from the pandemic, while the absence of disaggregated data hinders the adoption of tailored measures to address their needs. It is time for this neglect to end. I note that pandemic response plans in Australia and Costa Rica laid out specific efforts to protect the health of indigenous people, while Panama is implementing a long-term project to improve basic services and infrastructure, including healthcare in its 12 indigenous territories. The Russian Federation has reported that it is using remote technologies to improve medical services for indigenous nomadic groups in the context of the pandemic. COVID-19 aggravates the exclusion and discrimination suffered by women and girls. Their lack of social protection, stemming from their concentration in informal, low-status and low-paid jobs, their burden of care for children and the elderly, and the continued exclusion of women from decision-making. Pervasive gender-based violence has also grown in the last few months, with an increased number of users of 24/7 hotlines for domestic violence. This situation risks rolling back hard-fought gains for women's health, economic participation, and equal rights. Older people are suffering the highest death tolls and worst medical harms. The shocking rates of contagion and death in residential care homes suggest profound shortcomings in the approach taken by some national authorities to the pandemic impact on the care home sector, as well as the quality of medical surveillance and services they provide. I joined the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights in calling for social care reforms that prioritize individualized support to older people and promote their full inclusion in their communities. The provision of vital services for people with disabilities should also be significantly strengthened. Places of detention require upgraded health care, and non-custodial alternatives should be expanded. I welcome action taken by numerous governments to enable the release of tens of thousands of prisoners in line with our calls to address contagion and overcrowding. I urge a stronger focus on releasing women and children who are deprived of their liberty in light of the low numbers released globally, as well as action to uphold foreign detainees' rights to consular assistance. The pandemic is also likely to generate profound and long-lasting impacts on children. UNICEF has reported that unless there is urgent action to protect families from the economic impacts of the pandemic, the number of children living below national poverty lines could increase by 15% in 2020, reaching 672 million. The World Food Programme estimates that the number of young children suffering acute malnutrition could increase by 10 million this year. Disruption to schools and training programs heightens the risk of the poorest children falling behind and increases children's exposure to the threat of domestic violence, child labor, child marriage, and female genital mutilation. We're also seeing signs of a surge in online sexual exploitation of children. The closure of training programs, higher education, and jobs also creates heavy burdens on young people under the age of 25. Globally, over 75% of young people work in informal jobs, often in very hard-hit sectors, such as restaurants and entertainment services. This will have a profound impact on many countries, as well as on migration trends. Young people under the age of 30 account for around 70% of international migrant flows. Already the pandemic's interlocking health, socioeconomic, and protection impacts are deepening the suffering of migrants. In particular, many migrants are detained and overcrowded and in unsanitary centers such as in Greece, Honduras, Malaysia, and Panama, where they are at risk of infection, as well as forced return to fragile health systems. I'm dismayed by reports indicating that in many countries, members of minority communities and migrants face increasing stigmatization, including in some cases by officials. In Sri Lanka and India, members of the Muslim minority have been targeted by stigma and hate speech associating them with COVID-19. In Bulgaria, Roma people have been stigmatized as a public health threat, with some local authorities setting up checkpoints around Roma settlements to enforce lockdowns. In Pakistan, hate speech against religious minorities remains virulent. Stigmatization and threats against people presumed to be infected by COVID-19 have also been reported in Haiti, Iraq, and many other countries. In its urgent debate 2 weeks ago, this Council rightly highlighted the importance of principled and non-discriminatory policing in upholding human rights. I welcome the opportunity to intensify our work relating to justice for people of African descent and other discriminated communities at a time when people across the globe are demanding change, not just with regard to police violence. Too often, unjust and violent actions by law enforcement personnel reflects systemic racial discrimination that is deeply embedded in the institutions across society, as recent events, including COVID-19, have shown, it is time for urgent and deep change in many states. Discrimination kills. Depriving people of their social and economic rights kills, and this death and harms damage all of society. COVID-19 is like a heat-seeking device that exposes and is fueled by systemic failures to uphold human rights. Without rapid and decisive national and international action, the pandemic will put an end to hopes to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Particularly in the world's poorest countries, the high toll of death and medical harms, massive loss of jobs, especially in the informal economy, disruption to education, rising food prices, and deepening poverty are likely to drive tens of millions of people into extreme poverty and doing a decade or more of development gains. The Secretary General has warned of an imminent global food crisis with long-term repercussions for hundreds of millions of children and adults. I urge all world leaders to grasp the vital importance of this moment and to take immediate action to support the work of multilateral institutions that are struggling to assist countries and people in this crisis. Across the world, COVID-19 is also being instrumentalized to limit people's rights to speak, to express opinion, and to participate in making decisions that affect their lives. In the Russian Federation, China, Kosovo, Nicaragua, and many other countries, I note reports of threats and intimidation against journalists, bloggers, and civic activists, particularly at the local level, with the apparent aim of discouraging criticism of the authorities' responses to COVID-19. In each, I'm concerned by restrictions on freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, including with respect to online discussion of the spread of COVID-19, as well crackdowns on civil society with asset freezes, intimidation and arrest targeting human rights defenders, journalists, political activists and their family members. El Salvador's pandemic response had led to numerous reports of excessive and arbitrary enforcement of measures, as well as announcements that undermine the authority and independence of the country's institutions, disregarding rulings made by the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court and legislation adopted by the Legislative Assembly. Censorship and criminalization of speech are likely to suppress crucial information needed to address the pandemic. I only respect for their rights, including the right to participate in transparent and accountable decision-making, will inspire people to trust the policies adopted by the governments. Harmful disinformation should be countered by efforts to provide credible, accurate information from authoritative sources and promote social media literacy. Journalists, human rights defenders, and civil society activists can assist the authorities to identify and resolve shortcomings in their COVID-19 responses, and crackdowns are not only unjust violations of their rights, they damage the effectiveness of policies to prevent and mitigate the impact of the pandemic. Madam President, it is vital that leaders maintain consistent, credible, and fact-based communication with the people they serve. I'm encouraged by the Republic of Korea's open and communicative approach to leaving no one behind in its response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The government acknowledged early on the need for comprehensive policies that reach the most vulnerable in Korean society, including older people, the homeless, the LGBTI community, and undocumented migrants. I commend the authorities for exempting medical institutions from reporting the undocumented migration status of their patients and for recently enabling anonymous testing after issues which resulted in increased stigmatization of LGBTI people. I encourage consideration and swift adoption of a comprehensive anti-discrimination law building on the lessons learned from its response to the pandemic. In contrast, in Belarus, Brazil, Burundi, Nicaragua, Tanzania, and the United States, among others, I'm concerned that statements that deny the reality of viral contagion and increasing polarization on key issues may intensify the severity of the pandemic by undermining efforts to curb its spread and strengthen healthcare systems. Madam President, COVID-19 is deepening local and regional threats to peace. People in states where health and essential services have already been devastated by conflict and crisis are acutely vulnerable to the pandemic's multidimensional harms. I reiterate my call for the easing or suspension of sectorial sanctions in order to ensure that medical care and aid is accessible to all, and I reaffirm my strong support for the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire to enable effective pandemic action. In Yemen, armed clashes continue across the country, despite initial encouraging responses to the Secretary General's call for a ceasefire. The current rapid spread of COVID-19, as well as cholera, malaria, and dengue fever, make it imperative to allow unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid. The very high rates of severe complications and death from COVID-19 reflect the widespread destruction of Yemen's health and sanitation infrastructure and the poverty and vulnerability of civilians generated by 5 years of conflict. Many health workers in the country have no protective equipment, according to reports, and most are receiving no salaries. My office has also verified cases of intimidation and arrest of people suspected of having COVID-19 and health workers who discussed the epidemic in the north. Access to humanitarian assistance is also of critical importance in Syria, where healthcare centers repeatedly bombed during almost a decade of war could be swiftly overwhelmed. OSHA estimates that 80% of people in Syria live below the poverty line, and the World Food Programme has already documented rising food insecurity. Continued and increased cross-border access is essential, and I urge extension of the authorization of cross-border aid by the Security Council, as well as the reopening of the Al Arabiya border. I'm also concerned that the current grave human rights situation in the Sahel region may further deteriorate as the impact of COVID-19 increases people's suffering, poverty, and grievances. Already armed extremist groups are strengthening their influence over local communities in central and northern Mali, northern Burkina Faso, and parts of the Lake Chad Basin. Several communities in Burkina Faso and central Mali have created armed community-based groups, in some cases with the support of state authorities, with growing reports of their involvements in killings, abductions, forced conscription of children and adults, and extortion. Increasing human rights violations by the armed forces have also been documented in several countries, and displacement is rising sharply across the region, heightening people's vulnerability to the contagion to COVID-19. I urge all G5 states to step up efforts to ensure accountability for allegations of human rights violation by security forces and to strengthen as much as possible the presence of civilian authorities and the provision of services. The Office will continue to strengthen our field presences and our work with the compliance framework of the G5 Sahel Joint Force. In South Sudan, COVID-19 could further heighten the extreme vulnerability of its population. Many, if not most, South Sudanese do not benefit from adequate healthcare systems, as a recent report by my office confirmed. In addition, the slow pace of implementation of the revitalized peace agreement, including the appointment of governments and failure to address root causes, put the country at significant risk of renewed generalized violence. Community-based militias and self-defense groups are being armed with military-grade weapons and used as proxy fighters by all parties, and these localized and intercommunal attacks are already causing very high numbers of casualties. Haiti, where almost 60% of the population lives under the poverty line, is a clear example of countries where, after years of crisis, the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 is likely to be devastating, further fueling social grievances, criminality, and unrest. Zimbabwe is yet another country where COVID-19 is exacerbating severe challenges. Last month, 3 women from the main opposition party were reportedly abducted and tortured in the context of enforcement of COVID restrictions and were later charged with false allegations and incarcerated. However, recent decisions by the country's courts could indicate a pathway towards greater justice and a more sound foundation of governance. This includes rulings that the government must make provisions for access to water as a right and must provide protective equipment to frontline workers, that people with disabilities have a right to information about the pandemic in accessible formats, and that law enforcement must respect human rights and the work of journalists while enforcing lockdown measures. Action in this direction could help build a new and transformative path for many countries. Excellencies, the pandemic is not over again. Yesterday, Dr. Tedros said the worst is just to come. So we need to continue working together to defeat the pandemic and its health and socioeconomic consequences, to ensure that the suffering of people is ended as swiftly as possible, and to enable effective recovery. Policies must address the inequalities and protection gaps that have made society so vulnerable. They must look ahead, strengthening human rights protections to prevent such crises in the future. The Secretary General's call to action for human rights is a strong and principled framework for coordinated action to realize a rights-based recovery, including the human rights to a healthy environment. The European Commission's proposal for a multi-year response to the pandemic that tackles action for renewable energy together with public health and socioeconomic support, committing to leave no one behind, is an example of sound leadership. I know that in some countries the recession sparked by the pandemic is already leading to calls by industries for regulations to be relaxed, including in sectors where human rights abuses are often reported. Such calls should be resisted. We need to build a new economy that is environmentally sustainable, equitable, fair, and inclusive. I encourage all states to ensure that economic aid and stimulus packages for businesses stipulate that beneficiary companies should follow the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This conditionality has already been included in business aid measures adopted by Denmark. The pandemic and its impact must be addressed with coordinated and global work, including for a vaccine, which must be viewed as a global public good. A person's wealth, gender, or migration status should not determine accessibility to a vaccine that may save individual lives, but also the future of economies and societies. Any lack of international cooperation and any efforts that prioritizes private profit or political gain over public health will extend repeated cycles of infection and hinder economic recovery. Swift and effective measures have been taken by many developing countries, including Africa, drawing from the region's expertise in contact tracing and community-based public health. But the epidemic is spreading, and to hold it back, many countries will require sustained international support, including debt relief and direct financial investment to shore up health systems and ensure fulfillment of the right to development. To facilitate effective responses that address the human rights impacts of COVID-19, my office has issued detailed guidance regarding emergency measures, the civic space, detention, indigenous people, migrants, minorities, women, racial discrimination, LGBTI people, older people, and people with disabilities. We have also developed a framework of 10 human rights indicators, building on the data frameworks of the SDGs and the Global Humanitarian Response Plan, to enable clarity in identifying especially hard-hit and vulnerable groups and assist the implementation of effective policies to avert these harms. These key indicators have been appended to the framework document that guides all UN socioeconomic responses to COVID-19. To further advance this vital work and ensure that human rights are at the heart of the response to the pandemic, we need support. Global socioeconomic forecasts predict at least 2 years of dramatic decreases in human development indicators across the world. We have accompanied and shared your determined efforts to maintain the health, safety, and well-being of your peoples at huge cost on every level. But without close and targeted attention to social cohesion, to inclusion, and to fairness, these efforts cannot offset the deprivation that has swept up entire communities. We must all acknowledge that human rights are critical to the recovery. At this crucial time, we also need to be able to count on steady, predictable resources and firm political will in the months and years ahead. The risks are already enormous. A strengthened partnership can mitigate them. Your engagement can and will make the difference now and in the days to come. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. So as announced earlier, we will now watch a video by Mrs. Carrie Lam, Chief Executive of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region of the People's Republic of China.
Madam President, as Chief Executive of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region of the People's Republic of China, I welcome this opportunity to state our position on the enactment of national security legislation for the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. National security is invariably under the purview of the central authorities, be it in China or any other countries. In all countries, the power to legislate on national security rests solely with the central government. Hong Kong is an inalienable part of China, a special administrative region enjoying a high degree of autonomy, which comes directly under the central government. As an exceptional arrangement under the policy of one country, two systems, the basic law governing the two special administrative regions of Hong Kong and Macau obliges the SAR to enact local legislation on its own to safeguard national security. Macau has successfully completed this task in 2009. Hong Kong, after a failed attempt in 2003, has not been able to fulfill its constitutional duty. For the sake of not only the 7.5 million Hong Kong residents, but also the 1.4 billion people in the Chinese mainland, the question of how long we could tolerate such a gaping hole in national security has to be asked and answered. Legislation to safeguard national security is now urgently needed. Since last June, Hong Kong has been traumatized by escalating violence fanned by external forces. The threats of terrorist acts posed by illegal possession of explosives and firearms, and the horrible manners faced by innocent Hong Kong people were recapped by my senior police colleague Oscar Kwok and a prominent businesswoman Pansy Ho, respectively, when they spoke at this forum in March this year and September last year. Once rated as one of safest cities in the world, security and stability have become relevant concerns. During this period, groups advocating Hong Kong independence and self-determination incited protesters, very often radicalized young people, to desecrate and burn the national flag, vandalize the national emblem, and storm the central government's office in Hong Kong. Further, some local politicians proclaimed that they would paralyze the Hong Kong SAR government, while others campaigned for foreign governments to interfere in Hong Kong's affairs, or even to impose sanctions on Hong Kong. No central government could turn a blind eye to such threats to sovereignty and national security, as well as risks of subversion of state power. All in all, these acts have crossed the one-country red line and called for resolute action. As the highest organ of state power in China, the National People's Congress has the constitutional power and the duty to enact national security legislation for the Hong Kong SAR. The national law to be enacted has taken into account Hong Kong's actual situation and will be applied in Hong Kong by way of promulgation in accordance with the Basic Law. The legislation aims to prevent, curb, and punish acts of secession, subversion of state power, terrorist activities, and collusion with foreign or external forces to endanger national security. These crimes will be clearly defined in the law. It will only target an extremely small minority of people who have breached the law, while the life and property, basic rights and freedoms of the overwhelming majority of Hong Kong residents will be protected. The legislation upholds important legal principles such as presumption of innocence and protection of the rights of the suspect. It will have no retrospective effect. Except in rare specified situations, the Hong Kong SAR shall exercise jurisdiction over offences under the law. Investigation, prosecution, and adjudication will be undertaken by the Hong Kong Police and the Department of Justice of the Hong Kong SAR government and the independent judiciary, including that of final adjudication. The law will not affect Hong Kong's renowned judicial independence. It will not affect legitimate rights and freedoms of individuals, which are protected under the Basic Law and relevant international covenants applied to Hong Kong. They include, among others, the freedom of speech, of the press, of assembly, of demonstration, and of procession. In short, the legislation will not undermine one country, two systems and Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy. Hong Kong is a free and diversified society. We respect differences in opinion and strive on reaching consensus. But the one-country principle is non-negotiable and could not be compromised, as without one country, two systems will stand on shaky ground and Hong Kong's stability and prosperity will be at risk. For those foreign governments or politicians raising objections to the legislation, one could only lament the double standards they are adopting. All those countries which have pointed their fingers at China have their own national security legislation in place. We could think of no valid reason why China alone should be inhibited from enacting national security legislation to protect every corner of its territory and all of its nationals. Madam President, when I took office 3 years ago, I pledged to implement the one country, two systems policy, uphold the Basic Law, defend the rule of law, and promote a deep and positive relationship between the central government and the Hong Kong SAR. Despite the escalating tensions in society in recent years, I remain hopeful that with full conviction in one country, two systems, and upon implementation of the national security legislation, Hong Kong will ride out the political storm since last June and emerge stronger with stability restored. I and the Hong Kong SAR government are determined to capitalize on our strengths, harness the opportunities presented by a country's development, and provide Hong Kong people with brighter prospects. I urge the international community to respect our country's right to safeguard national security and Hong Kong people's aspirations for stability and harmony. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will